This will be Exodus part 7. And we were brought right up last week to the last plague, the death of the firstborn. And in doing that, we're going to cover the Passover feast and the departure from Egypt. We won't make it. We won't make it very far. We ain't going to get to the Red Sea. But just kind of recapping a little bit, because I want to bring you into this meal, okay, so that you can be right there. These plagues have lasted about 10 months. And we've seen it in that the livestock was killed, and the harvest, all the harvests were devastated by hail, and what the hail didn't get, the locust got. And we looked at all of those gods, the Nile and everything. All of those gods of Egypt had been defeated before the only true God, who is the God of the Hebrews, whose name is Jehovah. Now we've come up to the month of Abib, or Nisan, which answers to our month of April. 9 plagues are over us. And we touched on this a little bit last week, but I want you to see how these days play out. So you gotta stay with me here. The last week, remember, Moses goes into Pharaoh. As he's leaving, Pharaoh says, "You won't see my face anymore." Moses, yeah, that's right. Because that night at midnight, the judgment of God was going to fall upon the firstborn. Okay? So that's where we were. Remember, Egypt, they're in darkness. Moses goes into Pharaoh. "You won't see my face anymore." You know, Pharaoh says, "Moses, you won't see my..." Because at midnight that night, darkness is going to fall. So I want to give you a little bit of chronology here. From Exodus 10 and verse 22. Moses stretched forth his hand towards heaven, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt. Thick darkness for 3 days. But the scripture also says that Israel had lights in their dwellings. Verse 23, Israel had light in their dwellings. But let me read on right here in verse 24. Pharaoh called unto Moses and says, "Go serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be stayed. Let your little ones also go with you." Moses said, "Thou must give us also sacrifices, burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice them to the Lord our God. Our cattle also shall go with us. There shall not a hoof be left behind." Okay? But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He wouldn't let him go. Pharaoh said, Get thee from me. Take heed to thyself. See my face no more." Now, if we go into chapter 11, the Lord said unto Moses, "Yet I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt afterwards. He will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. Speak now in the ears of the people, let every man borrow of his neighbor, jewelry and all these things. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians." What you're told right there is what Moses knew and what's been happening. So you could read this. In the Bible, we got numbers and stuff now and verses and all this other stuff. So you could read from Exodus 10 and 29 and then jump right to Exodus 11 verses 4 and 5. When the Lord, and Moses says, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight will I go into the midst of the people, and all the firstborn of the land shall die." And in verse 8, "And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get out. And all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And I went out from Pharaoh in a great anger." See what I mean? Moses goes into Pharaoh and says, about midnight, all the firstborn's going to die. In chapter 12, it tells us the lamb of the Passover was to be eaten that night. As the angel of God's wrath moved across Egypt, Israel was over here eating the Passover lamb. And it says the lamb must have been picked out on the 10th of the month. In Exodus 12 and 3, in the 10th day of the month they shall take them a lamb. It's now the 14th. Okay, the 10th of April they're picking out a lamb. That's my birthday, by the way. And the 14th of the month is going to be this last plague, the death of the firstborn. So before the plague of darkness hit, the word went out to Israel to pick out a lamb. Because the plague of darkness was 3 days. Right? Can you see how I'm doing my math here? We know Passover's this day right here because he goes into Pharaoh and says at midnight, all's going to die. So we know that's the 14th. We know before the darkness hit, 4 days earlier, God says pick out a lamb. So Israel's picking out a lamb. Then the darkness hits for 3 days. But Israel had lights in their dwelling. So when the darkness came, Israel had already picked out their lamb. And they're watching their lamb. They saw the darkness in Egypt. What do you see? They're watching their lamb. They had their promise of deliverance. You see what I'm saying? So as Moses goes into Pharaoh and says, big guy, tonight, this is going to happen. The lamb had already been watched over and was ready to die. So here it is, the chronology. April 10th of Abib, Nisan. Every male head of the family had to go select a lamb. And the lamb had to be 1 year old and without blemish. One lamb for every family. So there was the patriarch of the family. He was the head of the family. Now in our society, mostly that would just be the dad. But these guys lived together. So the patriarch of the family could have been the dad, he could have been the grandpa, he could have been the great-grandpa. But anyway, whoever was the head, the patriarch of that family, would pick out that lamb. And we've looked at this before, but each family was very carefully defined. They would, these families were together in one house in a few days' time. If there were a very few people left in that family, then two small families would come together to form one unit, all having one lamb. Now this is important. You'll see where this, every detail in the scriptures is important. But it was one lamb to one unit of people. You get what I'm saying? Whatever it took to constitute that unit of people, there was one lamb for that unit of people. They selected that lamb on the 10th. On the 11th, they began to watch it. They had to make sure it was without blemish. So every day they would go out and part its little wool and look and check this lamb to make sure it didn't have any blemishes in it. We can get this from the writings of the rabbis later on. They even examined the eyelids to make sure that it had no blemishes. So on April 10th, we're picking out a lamb. On April 11th, we're starting to watch the lamb. On April the 12th, this darkness comes. You with me now? Darkness comes on Egypt. Can you feel the excitement? We don't really know what's going on. Moses just told us to go get a lamb. Patriarch of the family went and got a lamb. Now he says to make sure that lamb's without spot or blemish. So we're looking at this lamb, and all of a sudden I look out, and all of Egypt is in great darkness. I'm looking at a lamb. I mean, they don't quite know the why or the wherefore of this. All they know is this has something to do with this lamb. All they know is after this plague of darkness, they're going out of this place by the mighty hand of God. So they watch. They got light in their dwelling. Right? I mean, it says it right there in that scripture. They had a light to watch that lamb, to examine that lamb by. Darkness is swirling in Egypt. Remember, they had a darkness that could be felt. Remember we talked about that? You couldn't even light a candle. But Israel had lights in their dwelling so they could examine the land. So on the 10th, we're picking out a lamb. On the 11th, we're watching the lamb. On the 12th, the darkness comes. What are we doing on the 13th? We're still watching the lamb. Egypt is in such a mess, they can't even get out of their beds. You see what's happening here? And Israel's over here watching their lamb. And so on the 14th of April is when Moses goes into Pharaoh and states, about midnight, the firstborn's going to die. Pharaoh says, get out, you'll not see my face anymore. So on this day of the 14th, still darkness over here in Egypt, light over here in Israel. About 3 p.m., somewhere between 3 and 6 p.m. in the evening on the 14th, the lamb was to be slain. Its blood was to be caught in the basin. Remember, the Egyptians are still in their thick darkness. Israel's over here slaying a lamb, all this on the 14th. Then they were to take the hyssop. You guys know the hyssop, that was that weed that they took and bound together like a paintbrush. They would put the blood on the doorpost each side and across the top. And the family was to go inside. And the lamb was to be, I'll say it this way, barbecued, roasted with fire, Scripture said. Couldn't be sodden with water. Couldn't be boiled. You can't boil this thing. We got a barbecue. Now, we'll get into these numbers next week, but we know there was about 3 million people that came out of Egypt. 600,000 men, not counting women and children. So if you do the math, there's probably about 250,000 lambs being barbecued at the same time. And I would imagine the Egyptians was getting a little nervous. I mean, what's next? Every time Moses shows up, some kind of plague and devastation comes and wipes us out. Blood turns to water, frogs and flies and lice and everything we've known and boils and now this thick darkness. And now I smell 250,000 barbecued lambs going on at one time, and it's so dark I can't get out. I can't see a thing, but I can sure smell something's cooking. You see what's going on here? Inside the Israelites' house, you got these units of people. Families. It's what they were now become, whatever it took to make that family. They placed that full lamb on the table with the, next to it was the bitter herbs, because they was to remember the bitterness in Egypt, all of that they're leaving behind. I know you know all this stuff. I just want to rehash it here. Not one bone of the lamb was to be broken. Every part must be eaten by every member of the family. Nothing can be left. All had to be eaten. That's the reason we had to get the family right. And they had to eat it in a hurry. There wasn't no mom saying, slow down and taste it. Eat it. Shove it in there. It's eat, eat. It's eat with urgency. Because why? We're going out tonight. We're leaving. I mean, you got to think about this. I mean, what do you do when you're getting ready to take a trip? You pack and do all. These guys are leaving forever. I mean, you just think about that. You got everything packed and ready. We're going out tonight. Sandals on their feet, staff in their hand, girded up, ready to go. We got to eat this meal and we're gone. And during the night of the 15th, the reason I say 15th is because the 14th to the Hebrews ended at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. would be the end of their day, right? Because the evening and the morning was the first day, or was their day. So in the evening of the 14th, it ended at 6 p.m. So on the 15th, around midnight, would be the day that they left Egypt. It says in verse 12:31, and he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye, the children of Israel, and go and serve the Lord as ye have said. That's Exodus 12:31. And they left. The Lord said, all right, guys, it's time to go. So now I've got this mighty army of people, if you will, clan, whatever, all marching out, with all Egypt, including Pharaoh, telling them to get out, thrusting them out. One like where you're going, it's like, hey, we've called all the cops, we've set all the street lights to green, we've got your police escort, go. We took all the traffic jams down, go. All of y'all, get out. Now, we know why, because at this time, all the firstborn had just died, right? Every firstborn. All in Egypt. All the firstborn children, all the firstborn cows, firstborn dogs, all the firstborn died. Except for Israel, who was in the blood-covered house eating the lamb. They had just eaten the lamb. They were under the covering of the blood on the door. And you remember we started this thing off, it was all an issue about the firstborn. Remember we covered that. God says, Israel is my firstborn. Pharaoh, which is it going to be? You going to let my firstborn go, or am I going to take yours? Which is it going to be? And I'm just kind of giving you the highlights of this thing. At this particular juncture, Israel had been in the Egyptian calendar. You know what I mean? But God says, we're going to start a brand new calendar. And this is going to be your new year. I mean, he says it right here. This shall be the beginning of months for you. The Egyptian New Year started with the rising of the Nile when all this started. Probably about the end of May, 1st of June. That was the Egyptian New Year. That was where they were. But now Israel's coming into a brand new year. This shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So to the Jews, the first month of the year, their new year, starts off with Passover. Isn't that so fitting? Starts with Passover. And in that Passover, we know that the blood on the doorpost formed a wall of blood, if you will. As they walked into a house, they had to walk through the wall of blood. And I had to go back and look this up, because Abraham in Genesis 15 had to walk through the wall of blood. Now, the reason I know that, because when Abraham, he sees the covenant taking place. Didn't this sound the smoking furnace, the burning lamp? Abraham is in his thick darkness. A great horror of darkness came over him. He's in can you see all this playing out? A great horror of darkness came over Abraham. So Abraham was not in the covenant. The covenant's between the Father and the Son. They walk between the pieces. And after they get through the pieces, now they turn to Abraham and says, would you like to be included into this covenant? And God cut covenant with Abraham. He just saw what was taking place. So Abraham now has to walk through the very wall of blood. The same wall that these covenant children of Abraham has got to walk through. You see what I'm talking about? These children of Abraham, children of the covenant, must also pass through the blood. And as they do, they're receiving for themselves all that was in the covenant God made with Abraham. You see what I'm talking about? They were receiving to themselves all that was in the covenant. Now, I know in one of the movies, I think the movie with Charlton Heston, sometimes they might have dragged some in kicking and screaming, you know, that didn't want to go in. This wasn't the case. Because you just couldn't go into the house and eat the lamb. Now you're thinking, well, why does he say that? What happened to Moses on the way back? Thou art a bloody husband to me. You wasn't circumcised. You couldn't go through the blood, and you couldn't eat the lamb. You see where I'm going here? Only those who were circumcised could partake of the Passover and shelter under the blood. In other words, you had to be, even if you were an Egyptian, you couldn't just say, hey, can I come over to your house and stay all night here? It's going to be bad tonight. You had to be a committed member of Israel. You had to come by way of circumcision. You had to walk through the blood. Then you had to come in and eat the lamb. This is the reason I was telling you earlier. Salvation is a way. It's a journey. It's not just, oh, I accepted Jesus in my heart and I'm saved, let's move on. These guys had to be committed. And we know many Egyptians did submit. They surrendered. They gave up all their gods and came because there was a mixed multitude that came out. And except you were circumcised and went through the blood and ate the lamb, you couldn't come out. So we know that this mixed multitude had become part of those families. They understood that it was a blood covenant and it demanded their total commitment to the God of that covenant. So their being saved was directly and immediately linked with their commitment to the Savior. Now, as they leave, this blood takes on a very special meaning. Let me read Exodus 12 and 13. The blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are, or a sign of the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. The plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Here's the two parts of this. This is God telling Moses and telling all the people, the blood is going to be a sign to you, and when I see the blood. So the blood was a sign to God, and it was a sign to Israel. And the first part of this thing is God is telling Israel, you were no more deserving of life than the Egyptians. Y'all were in the same boat. A lamb had to die for you. Okay, you didn't get into this thing because you were the best and the greatest, and no, y'all were in the same boat. If no lamb would have been slain, they would have died with the Egyptians. When that plague came over, they would have all died. Israel had accepted the given substitute. Remember, it was given. They didn't come up with it. God said, take a lamb. What God had provided, you know, and don't just take us all the way back to Abraham. God will provide himself a lamb. And they put that blood on the door, And God says, when I see the blood, it satisfies me. My holiness is satisfied. Remember, we were talking about Sunday, I believe, about the righteousness of God, how sin must be dealt with. That's the justness. It has to be dealt with, but at the same time, He loves us. When I see the blood, God's holiness is satisfied. God's holiness demands justice. Sin must be dealt with. And Israel, we'd seen this before, had become so mixed up with the Egyptians you couldn't tell one from the other. So God gave them the lamb. When I see the blood, I accept that blood is my sign, and I give it to you. It's a sign to you. You can look at that blood and know that you have claimed your share of the covenant. I'll say that again. You can look at that blood and know that you have claimed your share in the covenant. And I'll just say this, we'll get there in a few minutes. Something's missing here in this Passover. They never drank the blood. Except you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part. In this original Passover, there was no drinking of the blood. The blood was on the door. All the blood was on the door. There was no drinking. We'll maybe touch a little bit on that here in a few minutes. It's a sign to you. Let me go over here. You remember we had talked about these covenant words. Hesed, loving kindness. Go over here to Psalms 106. In verse 7. Our fathers understood not thy wonders in Egypt. They remembered not the multitude of thy mercies. That same word, loving kindness. But provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. That mercy, loving kindness. That was a word, we know that's a word of covenant. When a person is bound by covenant commitment, God says, all those wonders that I did down there in Egypt, I did it because I was bound to you by covenant. And this one, this death of the firstborn, is going to be the grand finale. And He's going to bring you out. And the blood on the doorpost is to remind them that He is bringing them out by covenant commitment. It's His loving kindness. And that's the foundation of faith. Look for so long to try to define faith. But faith has to have a word to respond to, a foundation to rest upon, to build upon. Faith. And now I see where faith begins. You know, in our mindset, faith is, well, just believe real, real hard. Faith is a response to something. Now let me go over here to Hebrews, and I'll show you. Look here at Hebrews 11 and 28. Through faith he kept the Passover. We're talking about Moses here. And the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So why did they kill the lamb? By faith. Why did they put the blood on the door? By faith. How did they eat the lamb? By faith. I mean, they did all this of faith. Of course it was by faith. They were responding to something. To what were they responding to? It was the statement of covenant. God said that He would do it, and they responded. God said He would do it, they responded. I mean, I want you to think about that. You respond to it. God said, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. And we respond to that in what? Trust, in faith. Faith can only be understood as a response to a covenant promise. And just a little side note, when they left, and Pharaoh's firstborn died, all in Egypt died, That was the last of the gods of Egypt to die. Because remember, Pharaoh himself, Ra, thought of himself as being a god, and his sons a god. They're dead. There was no god now left in Egypt. It was completely devastated. That's why there was a mixed multitude that seen the writing on the wall that had come out. But they never forgot that God brought them out by the firstborn. Why do I say that? In Exodus 13, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, sanctify me all the firstborn. Whatsoever opening the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast, it belongs to me. It's mine. Now, in a sense, well, more than just a sense, all the firstborn in Egypt died. Israel and Egypt. Egypt's firstborn dying was the judgment. Israel's firstborn, it was the nature of their salvation. Because right here in Exodus 13, God is telling them, all of the firstborn belongs to me. All the firstborn belong to me. They all belonged exclusively to the Lord. So what would happen? Every firstborn that was born had to be offered to the Lord. Now you could redeem it. If you want your son, then you got to take him down there and redeem him and buy him back. He's not yours. He belongs to the Lord. That's why Mary and Joseph went to the temple when Jesus was little, because Jesus was the firstborn, born of a virgin. They had to take him down there and buy him back. Redemption, if they wanted him. I mean, can you see Samuel now? He was the Lord's, wasn't he? Hannah. He belonged to God. God says you can redeem him, you can buy him back. We'll discuss that more later. But the point is, every time, every firstborn son that Israel had, all the way up through Jesus, was all brought back to this one point right here. You see what I'm saying? It all stemmed from here. That's what I'm saying. If we can get a foundation of what happens in Exodus, man, it'll open up so much more over here in Ephesians and Philippians and all those places that people don't even see the connection. But they had to remember this firstborn. It was the nature of their salvation, that they belonged to the Lord. Now, in Exodus 13, here we move on down to verse 11 through 13. I'm just going to paraphrase here for time's sake. He says, when you guys get into the land, when you guys finally get into the land that I promised to bring you into, you guys are going to have farms. But just keep in mind, all the firstborn is mine. You know, you ever wonder where they got all those lambs? Solomon, how many did he sacrifice? All the firstborn belong to the Lord. And we went over this in our Birth of Jesus study, that they had these special lambs, special flock. They were called the temple flock. They were the firstborn. They're not yours. But right here in this Exodus, there's one beast that he picks out. This particular beast that would be right in the center of the barnyard, telling you the whole story. I'll just use this word, this donkey. God doesn't like donkeys. The firstborn of that one, if you don't redeem it, what do you do with the firstborn? You break its neck. I mean, that's what he says right here. The firstborn of the donkey, break its neck. What is that? That's killing. I mean, you're going to kill him anyway, but this one I want its neck broke. But he tells us our little redemption story right here, our salvation. He says, but if you want your little donkey back, you can get it back by what? Offering a lamb. Right in the center of the barnyard was the whole story of salvation, because the donkey is man. Now, I know that's not very complimentary, but that's who the donkey is. He's the man. Now, I know I said God doesn't like him. Yes and no. You understand where I'm going with this. I mean, Solomon says man is nothing but a natural brute beast. He wasn't talking about a mighty roaring lion. He's talking about that stupid, stubborn donkey, the mule. That word that Oakley was going to show us there in the show and tell. Man is stubborn and bullheaded. God calls us to obey when He first speaks. That's why Paul said He immediately obeyed. But what do? He says, don't be stupid like a donkey. Stubborn and stupid. It was always about their necks. You stiff-necked people. Stiff-necked. Stiff-necked. But either way, the donkey could be saved by the offering of a lamb. Even that stubborn, bullheaded donkey. So see, it's one thing to be saved, but it's another to understand the nature of your salvation. And here it was. I give it to you. Let's say that this person has an incurable disease. No known cure whatsoever. But I walk up and I say, I have the cure. Would you like it? They say, yeah, and they take it. But I mean, that's one thing. But here it is. But I say, if you drink this cure and you're immediately cured, there's a catch. You'll belong to me. You'll belong to me. You'll be my property. And that's what we're facing here. At this point, Israel is coming out of Egypt. Can you see what God is telling them? Israel, let me tell you something. You got this incurable disease called death. But I want you to understand something. I have the cure right here in the Lamb. But I want you to get this. Exodus 13. Why do you think it's thrown in there? I want you to understand something. When you come out, you belong to me. You belong exclusively to me. You're mine. I redeemed you. I brought you out. You're mine. You see, we just want a church of freedom, right? I'm free to do whatever I want. No. I brought you out to bring you in. You're mine. That's what Israel is facing right here. God says, yeah, you're free, but understand you're dead. I redeemed you into a new kind of slavery. So every time a firstborn occurs in your family or in your barnyard, remember, you belong to me. That's just a little note thrown right in there. See, all those little things are thrown in. Reminders. This will be a sign to you. This is a constant reminder. Every firstborn. Oh man, this is going to take us all the way back right here to this point. So we said the Passover started on the 15th. After the 15th started after 6 p.m. Right? So after 6 p.m. we know they came out at midnight. They walked out of Egypt. From the 15th of the month to the 21st of the month was this little feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was really a continuation of Passover. So every year on the 14th, you had Passover. From the 15th to the 21st was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we know that was when they were thrust out of Egypt. The women had to take the dough. They didn't even have any leaven to put in it. They just went. And we know the leaven, it has a couple of meanings. Number one, it's God brought them out so quick. So quickly. Boom. And we know that leaven is a symbol of corruption working inside of the dough. So they came out of Egypt. All the corruption of Egypt's been left behind. You're entering into a new life, an uncorruptible life, partakers of His divine nature. No leaven. the first day after the Sabbath of Passover, and this is why it's hard for us to get these days and all this stuff, because whenever Passover fell, it was to them a Sabbath. Okay? So I'm just throwing this out there at you. They knew the day that Passover would fall on. Soon as they got to the month Abib, on the 14th of that month, Passover. Well, that was a Sabbath. Well, what if that day was on a Tuesday? You see what I'm saying? So, yes, Saturday was their Sabbath, but now Tuesday was also another Sabbath. Do you see what I'm saying? So when it's one day after the Sabbath, it don't necessarily mean it was the Sunday. Because what if Passover fell on a Thursday? What if Passover fell? Because you know the 14th every year falls on a different day of the week. So the first day after the Sabbath of Passover, they had the Feast of First Fruits. And so I remember Passover extends into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? I've got Passover, and then as soon as Passover is over, the very next day, Passover is on the 14th. The 15th, I'm in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's going to go for 7 days. Right in the midst of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first Sabbath day after the Passover, shove in first Feast of First Fruits also. So I got 3 big things going on here. Passover, we just had a celebration of Passover. I just stepped right into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then boom, Feast of First Fruits is right in there with it. Now see, it's hard for us to think this way, right? Because all the Jews, this was just as common as Christmas. The Feast of First Fruits. And it fits into right here because when they came into Canaan is when that feast came into being. Because we read about all these feasts in Exodus and Leviticus and all that. Do you realize they never celebrated a feast other than Passover until they got in the land of Canaan? So we don't ever think about it. How could they celebrate Feast of First Fruits in the desert? They had no farms, they had no crops, there wasn't nothing growing out there. All they ate every day was manna. Right? So they couldn't do a sheave offering. So can you imagine the anticipation, waiting? We've read all these feasts, we've been going over these feasts for 40 years with Moses. Joshua's been preaching about them. We still haven't celebrated it yet. So here's this Feast of First Fruits. And on this day of First Fruits, now remember Passover was a couple days ago. In this Feast of First Fruits, right after Passover, a couple days ago, the priest would go out into the field, I'm talking when they came into the land, and he would find that patch of barley that was ripe, and he would circle it off, and they would cut that barley, because that ripe barley was the beginning of the barley harvest. The beginning of the barley harvest. They would make a sheaf out of it, and it would be the first sheaf of the harvest. And they would carry it into the temple, and they would present it to the Lord. This symbolized that all the harvest belonged to the Lord. And it was a day within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I know all this sounds boring. So I want to give you an outline here of Passover in history, because Passover changed. And this thing right that we're talking about here was known as the Passover of deliverance. But there was never a Passover like this one that took place coming out of Egypt. But over the years, things changed. And first, when they had a temple in Jerusalem, the lambs were slain in Jerusalem. They weren't slain in the house. So it moved from the house to the temple. Now these were God-given ordinances, right? He told them where to do it. Back over here in Egypt, all the lambs, the families, all these lambs. Over here at the temple. Over here in Egypt, the blood was put on the door. Over here in Jerusalem, the blood is put on the altar. Now just think with me. Imagine Passover feast at Jerusalem. Everybody showing up with their lambs. It would be very confusing. Lots of confusion going on. So lambs were specially bred. So the temple hired shepherds who specially bred these unblemished lambs. Now you remember in our Birth of Jesus study, we've seen that they couldn't have these lambs around Jerusalem. Matter of fact, they thought they were unclean, so the shepherds and all their flocks had to stay out in the wilderness. They were only allowed to come to Jerusalem one time a year, and it was this time of year when the flocks and these special shepherds would start to be gathered together to bring in these lambs for Passover. As they brought them in for Passover, these lambs would be sold to the worshipers. The reason being, the buyer, remember you just traveled this journey because the ordinance of God said you had to go up for Passover. So you came up for Passover. I know that I want to get a good lamb. So I'm trusting the priest and his hired shepherds out here that they have watched and gave me a good unblemished lamb. Right? So I can rest easy that the lamb I have is a good lamb because he come out of the special flock. So it made things a lot simpler. On the 10th of April, the lambs went into Jerusalem to be examined by the priest, ready for the Passover, which was going to take place on the 14th. So on the 13th day of the month, on the 13th, was the preparation for the Passover. Remember Jesus and then talking about the preparation, go prepare a place, and you know he's talking about all that stuff. On the 13th day, every Jew was to go through his house with a candle. Doesn't this go all the way back to Egypt? They had light in their dwellings. Every Israelite was to go through their house with a candle, searching for leaven. If they found any, it had to be taken and burned. And the head of the house, the patriarch of the house, would stand and pronounce over the house that it was free from leaven, it was free from corruption. Then at Passover on the 14th, at 3 p.m., in the temple on Mount Moriah, the priest would pull his knife out and cut the lamb's throat. They would catch the blood in the basin and sprinkle it on the altar. Then the lamb was taken back home. And now they're around the table, and everybody is dressed not in clothes of mourning. I'm talking, they're dressed in festive clothes, like you would come to a Christmas dinner. You're dressed nice, you're ready to celebrate. The lamb is at the center of the table. They're happy because they're the king's children. They've been delivered out of Egypt. God has fulfilled his covenant promise. They're all reclining, lambs in the center of the table. And over the years, there's been added these cups of wine. And at each cup of wine, they would recite certain parts of the Passover story. Bitter herbs on the table that would remind them of the bitterness that they came out of. And at the end of the table, there was an empty chair with a cup of wine there. And it was a special cup and a special chair, and nobody touched that cup, and nobody sat in that chair. No one touched it. They said that's for the Messiah. When Messiah comes, he'll take that cup of wine. And it'll be the beginning of a new day. And at one point in the Passover meal, I'm just giving you the Jewish Passover meal. The host the patriarch, the one who had pronounced the house clean. Now bring all these things around when Jesus said, you're clean through the word I've spoken. Remember he said that in John 15? John 15's after what? John 15's after John 13 when they were having the Passover meal in it. You're clean through the word. They're still in the Passover meal. He said you're clean. The patriarch of the house had to say, this house is clean. Jesus, the patriarch of the house, says, this house is clean. How? Through the word I've spoken. So the host would take these wafers, and over the years they had been placed in these little packages. They had 3 wafers in this pack, all divided. So they would like lay the little pack out, right? It had 3 wafers laying there. And the host would always take out the middle wafer and break that wafer and pass it around the table. Then they would drink of the wine, and then they would finish up by singing the Hallel, which was Psalm 113 to Psalm 118, I think. And they would sing, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. So if I was to do a chronology, I would guess here, and other scholars kind of have this date. So I didn't come up with this date. But if you was to celebrate the birthday of Jesus, it would probably be closer to being around April 9th. Because that's when the shepherds would be there bringing in their lambs, but yet they got word that a newborn king was there. They would be out in the wilderness all the other times of year. So you see a newborn king has been born. The shepherds, these special flock, these special shepherds are there when Jesus is born. Make no mistake, it's what John says, behold the Lamb of God. Because all this has to do with Passover. The lamb was always the Passover lamb. And you know this, but on the I think the 10th of April is when they brought in all the lambs. We call it Palm Sunday. Because as they got the gates open up and the herd of lambs is coming into Jerusalem, Jesus begins to ride in Jerusalem on the fold of a donkey. Isn't that amazing? They're getting ready for Passover. The Passover lamb, I mean, we just read this stuff over here about a donkey and all. And behold, he's riding in. Comes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. At the same time, these lambs are being examined, right? These priests, they're going through these lambs, this special flock. At the same time, Jesus is being examined and questioned by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians. He was questioned publicly in the same courtyard the lambs are being examined in. And in his very speech, the Roman soldiers and everybody said, never a man spake as this man spake. Same courtyard. They're looking at lambs, and Jesus is over there being examined himself, right amongst all the other lambs. And that brings us right to the Passover meal. See, this stuff gets exciting to me. The Last Supper was Passover. Most Christians don't know it. They'll say, well, that's the Last Supper. That was Passover. That was the last Passover God ever recognized. His Son was the host, the patriarch. Jesus takes out the middle wafer. Like all the other hosts around Jerusalem was doing. Jesus takes out the middle wafer, and he broke it. He broke the silence of centuries, because he said, this is my body, which is broken for you. Now, a lot of people wonder why the 3 wafers. We discussed that a little bit. It's not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because It's the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. The Son was the middle wafer. Luke tells us in his gospel, after that they had supped, eaten and all, at the end of the meal, Jesus didn't take just one of those cups, right? Because they had been drinking that wine and doing the Hallel all through there, right? They had been drinking that wine and doing all that other stuff. But Luke tells us he took the cup. Now, you know what cup he was taking. He took the cup that was set there for the Messiah. In the Messiah's chair as the host. And he grabbed that cup up and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant." This Passover was the old covenant. It's over now. We've sung the Hallel. Now, drink this. It's a new covenant. And it's in my blood. Nobody could ever drink the blood before. It was sprinkled and gone, but now it's something brand new. Not just the blood of the Lamb on a doorpost. You can eat his flesh and drink his blood. You can partake of him. And we know that lamb had to be roasted with fire, not boiled with water. Fire, and we can take this right into Gethsemane. When the fire of God's wrath of judgment was poured out upon him. And we know by 9 a.m. Jesus was delivered to be crucified. Now we know that the temple was built on Mount Moriah, right? Here's the temple, Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the same mountain Abraham went up to offer Isaac. Mount Moriah. Right in the center of Jerusalem, here is Mount Moriah. The temple's on it. We got the temple, we got the altar, we got the lamb. Do you know, just like this mountain over here, you know it's a long mountain? On this end is Mount Moriah. Same mountain, but if you go to the other end of Mount Moriah, you know what we call it? Calvary. It's the same mountain. It's not another mountain. It's the same mountain. At the end over here is the temple, and it's Mount Moriah and the land. At this end, it's Calvary. They're offering the lamb over here, and over here is the real Lamb of God. So we know Jesus was put on the cross at 9 o'clock, 9 a.m. Over here, all these other lambs are being prepared while the Lamb of God is on the cross. At noon, the priest would go into the temple and light all the lights. Make sure all the candles are burning in the temple. Make sure it's lit properly. Remember what we're doing here at Passover. They had lights in their dwelling. At noon, we know what happened. It was a great darkness fell upon the face of the earth. In that great darkness that fell upon the face of the earth, Jesus in that darkness cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" So it's dark all the way up till 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., the high priest had the lamb ready to go. At 3 p.m., they slit the lamb's throat. At 3 p.m., Jesus said, "It's finished," and he committed himself to the Father. John tells us they didn't break his legs. We know not a bone was broke. And the reason they would break their legs is because they would use their legs to push so they could breathe. Can you imagine? Jesus had not one bit of strength for himself, pushing up, no trying to get one breath. That amazes me. Jesus gave himself up with no thought for himself. as they were about to break his legs, they see he's dead. Now listen, these Roman guys loved torture. They loved it. I mean, you know, they enjoyed whipping a guy to death. They enjoyed crucifying. So this guy that goes up to break Jesus' legs, he's ticked off because he's already dead. He enjoyed breaking legs. Now that he can't break his legs, he in anger takes the spear and thrusts it into his side. Not a bone broken. Back over here in Israel, I'm going back to the first Passover when they came out. They ate of the lamb. They ate the whole lamb. It was in the sustenance of that lamb that they walked out of Egypt. Not only is the blood of Jesus shed for us, we actually eat of Christ. Christ who is our life. And as every family walked out of Egypt, one whole lamb was inside of that family. Do you get what I'm saying? That's why Paul said you're complete in him. So that body got together and they had the whole lamb in them. So every local body of Christians is a local expression of the whole Jesus, of the whole lamb. He lives in us all, and we have received him through covenant. Now, I just got to throw this out. I'm almost finished. I really am. I know it's a little long. Guess when the Feast of First Fruits fell? Because you forgot about first fruits, didn't you? You just thought I'd throw that in there. Guess when it fell that year? The day after the Sabbath Passover. The Sabbath Passover fell on a Saturday. The Feast of First Fruits fell on a Sunday. And as the priests were waving their sheaf of first fruits, of the barley fruits, Jesus rose from the dead. And just like the firstborn, the first sheep, Jesus was the first one. We are all the other sheaves. We're the other harvest. We're the other peaches on the tree. We hadn't been harvested at that time, but he was the first fruit and bore in himself the entire harvest. So Jesus died and buried and rose again. And the whole church experienced what he now experienced at that time. The Passover's over. That was the death. The first fruits is the resurrection. And he's now gone to the Father and gone as us and for us. And I love this, and I'm going to end right here. It's the Feast of First Fruits. Early that morning. They should be in a celebration, right? But here's Mary. Where is my Savior? What have you done with the body? She comes down to the tomb. She's not in celebration. She's in mourning. There's two angels standing there talking to her, asking her, why are you weeping? Why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here. Oh, just tell me where he is. Just tell me where he is. Where is he? And from the shadow of that tomb, searching that tomb, I can just see a shadowy figure standing there in the doorway of that tomb. She can't see who it is. She just looks up and sees a shadowy figure there, assuming he's the gardener. Where have you borne him? Where's he at? Where's my master? Weeping. She's supposed to be in a celebration. So what does he say to her? Mary. One little old word changed the whole world for her. And what does she respond? Master, Rabboni. And And I just love this little part. Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? I'll tell you where he is. He's risen. He's risen. So, can you see Mary now? Can you see this new little sermon she's got to preach? Because at the same time this is taking place over here on Mount Moriah at the temple, all the little priests has got their Shiva first fruits offering. And they're waving them to the Lord. They're waving them to the Lord. And can you see Mary just walking by them going back home saying, y'all can put up your little sheaves now. Because the first fruit has risen. The firstborn of a multitude has risen. And we shall come to know the Lord through him and in him. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I'll quit right there.